Hi, I'm Greg Kutsona, co-director of Science for the Church. And today I'm talking with Dr. Felicia Wusong, who's a cultural sociologist of media and digital technologies. And she's a professor of sociology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara. She has degrees in history, communication, and sociology from Yale, Northwestern, and the University of Virginia. And Felicia's research is oriented around the rapidly evolving world of digital technology. And I mean, don't we all experience how much it changes and shapes us? And she looks at how the adoption of social media and digital devices fundamentally alters the landscapes of our families, our communities, and just life in general. Her recent book is Restless Devices, Recovering Personhood, Presence, and Place in the Digital Age. So welcome to this conversation, Felicia.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be with you, Greg.
I have so much enjoyed getting to know your work, and I find it really important for my own life as a follower of Jesus, and also in understanding, how we're shaped by these digital devices that we walk around with. I thought we might start with those three words from your book before I get into maybe your background and how you came to faith in Christ and your own work in social science and so on. So I'd love to hear just maybe if you could talk about personhood, presence, and place in the digital age and how we recover each of those three things.
Yeah, sure. We're starting with the easy question, I see. Um,
Well, I know
so,
you're up for it because I've heard you respond to other things. So
well, yeah. So I think one of the things that is fascinating to me about our relationships with technology is the ways in which it shifts the meanings of words that have always been around, right? Personhood, presence, and place. And all of humanity has experienced that, right? But it changes our experience of what those words mean, right? And so when I think of personhood, or when I say personhood, I'm particularly interested and concerned about the ways in which our current iteration of digital technologies has a commodifying effect on us. And what I mean by that is that it encourages us to think of ourselves and even other people as brands, as commodities, as things that need to have certain kinds of value that others will want, right? So it becomes transactional. We become commodities ourselves, and we have a tendency to then forget or lose touch with the personhood, which is the intrinsic worth, right? The intrinsic dignity of ourselves, of each other, and the relationships that we can have with each other that have nothing to do with transaction, right? But is built into our imago Dei, right? The being in the image of Godness, right? And so I'm interested and concerned about the way technology kind of is kind of shifting the way we experience what it means to be a person, right? Do I exist if I'm not on Instagram? Do I exist if I'm not in social media? Right? Am I a person?
It's a little bit of a twist on that. If a tree falls in the forest,
exactly,
it still make a sound, right? If Instagram doesn't record what I'm doing, am I still a person?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. Or if I post something and nobody responds, like, did it even get said? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so all of that is really curious, I think. And but I think we all feel it, we all feel it when we're involved and engaged in those digital dynamics. When it comes to presence, I think our contemporary digital technologies have a tendency of putting our physical presence in the backseat, that is
Mhm.
wanting to really celebrate our capacity to not have to be embodied. And there are
Yeah.
really wonderful things that can happen when, I mean, you and I are having a conversation right now and we are
Right.
not in the same room, right?
Yeah.
And
Right.
that's amazing, and it creates incredible opportunities, right? And at the same time, um, there can be a loss
Yeah.
when we start to actually devalue our embodiment, and certainly devalue the embodiment of those who are proximate to us,
Right.
the
Right.
presence of others, right? And so there's this is where I think of the work of Sherry Turkle, an MIT
Mhm.
um, media scholar who's long written about young people and the ways in which um, it's as young people are growing and becoming people, um, that their socialization with digital devices, right, is concerning. That is an emphasis on what's happening on the screen over and above what's happening actually around them, and then
Right.
an inability to know how to relate to those who are actually sitting next to them or talking to the boy or the girl that is actually in front of them instead of texting, right?
Right.
And so
Right.
there's something about the weightiness, or we can use a kind of C.S. Lewis term, the kind of weight of glory, right? That is
Yeah.
in our presence, that is in each
Yeah.
other, right? That
Yeah. Yeah.
is awe-inspiring and appropriately fear-inducing in some cases,
Yeah.
right? But
Yeah.
learning to learn how to enjoy and be and engage each other's presence, I think is something that certainly having come out of the lockdowns during the pandemic, we all know, right? We all
Yeah.
know that there's something very distinct and important
Yeah.
about being able to be present, physically present with each other.
Right. Right.
Um, and then place, that's kind of related, but I think it is again the ways, what's concerning and interesting is the ways in which our digital technologies today um, have a capacity to remove ourselves from whatever the place is, kind of psychologically, cognitively remove ourselves, and helps us kind of neglect actually our proximate surroundings, whether it is
Yeah.
our neighborhood, um, or it is the supermarket that I'm standing in, or the beautiful sunset that's actually happening, and I'm not noticing.
Yeah.
Maybe because I'm
Yeah.
taking a picture of it and thinking about how I want to post it on Instagram or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's that famous thing, where I was in Florence last year teaching a class,
Yeah.
and like everything you do or everything that's done, you see people taking a selfie so they can then post it, right? I mean, instead of like just being there and taking
Yeah.
a little bit of time.
Yeah.
There's one part of your book that really, well, there's so many parts of your book that spoke to me, but one that deeply resonated was this fear we have of boredom. And I
Mm,
remember Blaise Pascal's comment that
mm.
I think it's something like all the problems in the world would be solved if we knew how to stay in a room by ourselves for 15 minutes. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah.
that sense of ennui and that sense of
Yeah.
like restlessness, and how our devices allure us to
Mhm,
say, oh, we can solve that problem for you, we can solve
mhm,
that pain.
mhm.
um, would it be fair to say that you want us to be a little more bored and to identify with that pain of boredom to some degree so that we can go to a deeper place?
I would say that I'm interested in us not being afraid of being bored,
Uh-huh.
actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and not relying on our digital devices to so quickly close off that possibility of becoming bored,
Yeah. Yeah.
because there are second order goods, as the philosophers say, right? That there are certain kinds of goods that can come out of experiencing boredom, even though boredom itself is a very unpleasant and negative experience.
Right. It may be a pathway to something that's deeper,
Yes,
I think
exactly.
we're gonna get, I'm sorry, I ran over what you were saying, but we're gonna get to a little bit of the church or the ministry, the church ministry applications, Christian spiritual life. But that was really throughout, Restless Devices was this recalling of a deeper spiritual life. I found it very soothing in a way,
Mm,
and
mm,
I mean challenging, and soothing, which was a really great
mm,
combination. So thank you
mm.
for that.
I'm so glad.
Um,
Yeah.
and while we're on the moment of compliments, which I have many for the book, but you're just a good writer, and I don't say that easily, quickly. I mean, you have a really alluring and inviting style. So
Mm,
I wanted to also just say that to anybody who might be listening
mm,
to this, that this is a book that you'll enjoy reading as well, which was great.
Thank you. Thanks.
One of the things then is learning a little bit more about how these two things of Christian faith and your work as a social scientist intersect. So,
Mm,
if you were to do a timeline of those two things, is there one that started before the other, or did they come together? In other words, your work as a sociologist and your faith in Christ. Would you mind giving a little background to either or
Yeah.
both of those, however
Yeah.
they weave together?
Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian home,
Mhm.
and attended a ethnically Chinese, Baptist, functionally Baptist church. Went off to college, joined InterVarsity.
Mhm.
And it was there during my college years that I learned two key things that I didn't really have a whole lot of prior experience with. And that was, that God really does love me, actually.
Mm.
That was a profound um, understanding to gain through community in college. And then I learned about the Holy Spirit. That
Mm.
was not a part of a large part of my Christian foundation up until that
Yeah.
point, and that the Holy Spirit transforms us and is present with us. All of that was incredibly just a revelation. And so, so I would say, I don't have, I do have like particular moments when I confirmed my commitments to the Christian faith, but there was never any sort of major conversion
Mm.
place.
Yeah.
Um, and
It's
what was
always been a
interesting,
part of your life growing
yeah,
up in
it
in
was
the
always
church and in the
there, and
Christian home. Yeah.
I didn't have any dissonance with it at any particular point. But I was
Yeah.
always learning new aspects of it that I didn't
Yeah.
fully grasp before.
Yeah.
And
Can I pause you in one
yeah,
part there before you get to the next thing?
yeah.
I was really touched by how much you were not wanting to shame your reader or bring more law in this book,
Mm,
in Restless Technology. It's like
mm,
it was permission giving. It was, I think it was challenging, but it was like this is not one more to do thing. In fact, you're
mhm.
trying to remove to do's
Yeah.
from our life. So does that come out of this sense of God's love for you that you experienced more deeply as you
Hmm.
grew as a Christian?
Yeah, I think it comes from um it probably comes more from being kind of having an achiever type personality that
Hmm.
then in my own faith journey has often ebbed into my faith,
Yeah.
and in unhelpful ways.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
in a kind of striving, a kind of spiritual striving,
Yeah.
that hasn't been fruitful, and that it
Right.
has required constant cycles back to the no, actually God loves you just all of the flaws and weaknesses, it's okay.
Right,
And
right,
that's
yeah,
just something I'm always in struggle with, in my
yeah,
own journey. And so
yeah,
not I think part of writing the book is, and also I think, um, when I'm in conversation with other people of faith about technology, is always feeling like there's this quick, tendency to feel shame about, one's digital, vices, or unhelpful habits, and to kind of move into, I think, not I don't know, again, not a helpful or truthful, actually, space. Um,
yeah,
so yeah,
yeah,
it's a bit of, knowing my own flaws and weaknesses and tendencies that
yeah,
drives me to
yeah,
write that way.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I think I
um,
probably interrupted you. You were talking to, I think, probably about your social science work and how that came to be. But
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So, I came to, I think, what a lot of, Christians, especially from the Reformed tradition, called the life of the mind. I
mhm,
came to the life of the mind, or the understanding that Christians could use one's intellect, um, for God's glory. That this was, again, a wholly new understanding I did not come to until after college. So I was a
yeah,
completely late bloomer on all of that. Up until then, it was just personal piety. It was personal transformation. That's what Christianity was. And then when I learned through some time at L'Abri Fellowship, actually
yeah,
up in Southborough, Massachusetts, that one could use one's mind, to bring a Christian perspective to any type of topic. That was when I started becoming interested in media and technology. I had
okay,
stumbled upon reading Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death,
yeah, and
Marshall
McLuhan too.
McLuhan.
Yeah,
Yeah. And so, it was from there that I, through a number of, um, personal and then professional connections, ended up in sociology, of all places, which I didn't know anything about, quite frankly. Prior to that, I was a history major in college. And so I was always interested in the ways that the cultural meanings of things have been developed. Kind of
yeah,
how did we come to believe, or understand community in certain ways, or identity? These terms were always very interesting to me. And so
yeah,
when I discovered that I could study that through sociology, I was like, okay, let's go do that. And
yeah,
so even though I studied technology in a lot of ways, my actual interests are in how we experience and understand community, identity, relationships. And technology is just the variable, shall we say,
right,
in
right,
social
right,
scientific terms, the variable that impacts those terms.
yeah,
Um, yeah, and so I was fortunate to work with James Hunter, who's a person of faith, at
yeah,
Virginia. And so for
yeah,
me, the combination of social science and one's faith, I really feel like it was a gift and a true luxury to have a mentor, an advisor who's a person of faith who could kind of walk with me in that. And
yeah,
I'd gotten really good advice from a graduate student early on about possibly seeking that out.
yeah.
And that really was a generative space for me,
That's
to
great.
just feel like I didn't have to, um, kind of set aside the animating questions that drove me, and that I could bring them into my intellectual growth and my social scientific, learning. Was always just cohesive, you know.
Hmm.
Um, so
Well,
yeah, and
one of
then
the
that
things,
yeah, go ahead.
no, please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say the book in many ways is The Restless Devices is my first chance to actually do that. I had
Mm,
written a prior book that was about virtual communities, and that was kind of a strictly academic text. But
yeah.
part of what was so fun and so, gratifying about this book was getting to do sociology and do some like informed theological reflections all in one
Yeah.
place. And that was super fun.
I like that. Yeah, and they're woven together really well.
Mm,
It's not like you sort of slap on the theology or slap on the sociology, whatever.
mhm,
You get that Christian mind that you're talking about is active in the book.
mm,
A mind which is, I think also very well. I just to say it's also very, deeply spiritually
mhm.
enriching. Well,
Uh,
I think about his idea of rationalization and the secularization thesis, and I'm personally very interested in the whole development of the nuns, because that's essentially how I
yeah.
grew up in the Bay Area.
Okay. Yeah.
For at least that reason, if not others. And it seems like the development of technology, especially the smartphone, carrying the internet around in our pockets or in our faces, really accelerated all of that process. I don't know if the secularization thesis
Mm,
that we're just going to become unreligious and secular has actually panned out. I think
mm,
Peter Berger was right about that,
mm,
but at the same time, I think there's something might call it the individualization process. Like
mm,
religions become so individualized
mm,
and so on. Anyway, the point being, it's like the growth of technology really is important in understanding the relationship of how sociology understands religious and spiritual life.
mm,
So to
mm,
me, there's a really interesting and
mm,
important connection there
mm,
in what you're doing.
mm.
I guess there's a question there somewhere. I mean, is there something you also see in terms of technology and your focus on technology, in terms of your work as a sociologist, and how that carries forward sociology in some ways?
Yeah. Well, I think it is like when you talked about rationalization, it is that point of contact between our particular iteration of digital technology. And I keep on saying that because it's like our technology landscape doesn't have to be the way it is, right? And it just
Right.
happens to be commercial. Right?
Yes.
And it happens
Right.
to be
Right.
commercial and commodified and it fits the existing industrialized, post-industrial society kind of framework. It's fit
Yeah.
right into it and it's just kind of
Yeah.
whipped it
Yeah.
up, right? And so for
Right.
me, I see it, and here my mind goes to like Zygmunt Bauman's work, love his stuff. It fits
Yeah.
with all of that kind of postmodern conditioned stuff that is very much connected to consumer society
Right.
and capitalism, and
Yeah.
so to me, that is where a lot of the conclusions I reach are similar, akin to so many others who have written on, consumer culture and commodification. Hochschild, all these different people who have
Right.
worked it out in different spheres of society. But I
Yeah.
think it's the same. It's the same dynamic.
Well, I think your emphasis on the marketplace and how we've become commodified is really powerful. That verse in the Sermon on the Mount, you can't serve both God and mammon.
Mhm.
It's just so accurate,
Mm,
because it is really difficult to serve God and have our personhood, even our place,
mm,
and our presence commodified. And
mhm,
you mentioned this in one of the podcasts I listened to, but these digital media companies, and I'm not making them evil, but
mhm,
they are grounded in what will be a profit to
mhm,
Google or
mhm,
Facebook or whatever, right? Twitter, et cetera. And the more that we give ourselves to them and
mhm,
our likes and our preferences
mhm,
and our profiles, we are giving away something,
mhm,
and we become more commodified. And
mhm,
I think I read in your book and in your work more generally, this desire to live for God ultimately. I don't mean
mhm,
to make it too simplistic, but like
mhm,
there's a spiritual openness that there is a divide at some level that we
mhm,
need to move more deeply into
mhm,
that spiritual life with Christ,
mhm,
and to resist that commodification of our digital devices. So I just found that really, really helpful. And it kind of is awakening at some level.
mm, yeah. I mean, I think um I think that incommensurable choice, right? God and
Yeah.
mammon, right?
Yeah.
I think of it as two stories, right? Like you can only live into one story.
Mm,
Every little thing that we're doing is living into one story or the other. And
yeah.
unfortunately, the digital story, so much of it is just completely opposite to what the Christian story is,
Yeah. Yeah.
unfortunately. And there are
Yeah.
many stories that one can live, right? But just
Yeah.
putting these two next to each other, it's like when you start comparing them, it's just like, oh wow, we're just, scarcity in the digital landscape versus the abundance that is promised in a life with God, right? It's totally different, right? Your
Yeah. Yeah.
orientation is just going to be one, or you can't do both.
No,
Right.
no. Well, I was just
Yeah.
thinking about the other day, and partly because of your book, but partly for other reasons too. Just all those texts that come in and that insert themselves in my life. You know what I mean? We're tempted to do them while we're driving, right? Which is completely dangerous, but it's what happens. Or maybe we'll do it at the stop sign or the stoplight, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like, I'm old enough that I remember before we had texting. I remember before we had really smartphones. I mean, definitely before I had smartphones. And it's like, it wasn't like we just sat around wondering what to do with those moments. And I think you point out some studies that indicate that we're actually, well, I think it was the Atlantic that had that article. Is Google making us stupider? Right? It's like
Yeah.
we're not able to get deeper into our
Mm,
thoughts
mm,
and our brain
mm,
patterns because we're
mm,
being continually bombarded by this stuff. And I
mhm,
I guess I just want to say you're honest about that you're part of that world, and I really
mhm,
appreciate that honesty. And I want to say that too,
mm,
like I'm part of this world. That's why I find this to be like
mm,
nourishment, to have another kind of vision for
mm, mhm.
technology.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think that what makes it so difficult to resist is both the 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 technology itself, like you're saying, the notifications that are just coming at you and pinging, right? But
Yeah,
then there's also um this cultural assumption or discourse that says, oh, I need to check it because that's what productive people do, right?
right,
Like
right.
I need to use every second of my life to
Yeah,
be, you know, aiming for that, zero inbox or crushing every response, right?
yeah,
Otherwise I'm not being productive, right? Which
yeah,
makes me a lesser person. And
yes,
so I think it is the commodification industrial rationalization story. It is the raw technological um mechanics, right,
yeah.
of what's happening now. But there's also this other kind of really interesting story to me about like productivity and what makes someone a good human being, right?
Well, and even
Um,
what you said earlier, that what makes you a person, like we're
yeah, right.
almost giving away our essential nature as beloved by God. Like that's the
Mhm,
most important thing to this
mhm,
idea that, well, it's how many likes we have. Like we're a bigger person if we have more likes on
mm,
Instagram, or more on TikTok. And I think that's a fundamentally spiritual question. I
yes,
mean, and it's also a
yes,
philosophical question, like who are we? You
yeah.
said it earlier. Are we anybody if we don't have a Facebook following or a Twitter
Mhm,
following? And
mhm,
I'll just be honest, I struggle with that
mhm,
as a content producer. And it's like,
yeah,
if I have whatever my 800 followers on
yeah.
Twitter, am I 1/100th the
Yeah,
value of an 80,000 follower person,
right.
right? You know what I mean? Um, so it's really crazy where
Yeah,
we go.
yeah, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about one of the great ideas you pick up from James Smith about counter liturgies
Mhm,
in your book, and utilizing counter liturgies in light of some of the problems of digital technology. And I want to say, in case we haven't said it clearly enough, that you're not saying you have to give away all of the engagement with digital technologies. It's
mhm,
just use I would say it's using Jesus's words. The Sabbath was made for us, not us for the Sabbath, right? So that these technologies are for us to use. We've created them. Can we use them properly? So anyway, can you say a little bit more about counter liturgies and what that means in light of digital technologies?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as you said, following Jamie Smith's work, right? The idea is that so many of our routine habits are like liturgies. They are forming us in a certain direction. And I want to argue that our digital habits are forming us away from God very often in the ways that we've just discussed. And so I think so many people that recognize that in their own lives think that, well, then we just need to detox. We need to get rid, right, of things, which may in fact be true. Maybe a particular person would benefit from getting off of social media or for getting rid of a device in their life. That might be so. But I think what's so interesting and what I find compelling about Smith's concept of counter liturgy is this idea that we are, as human beings, we're driven by appetites, right? We are, in Augustine's terms, right, restless until we find our rest in God. And so we may, in fact, remove things, but we still need to be filled with something good, right? You can remove, quote unquote, the bad, but removing, quote unquote, the bad isn't going to be enough, right? You've got to fill that space with something good. And so that's the counter liturgy, is what kinds of life additive practices can we bring in to fill out that space, right? That we might leave if we try to be more ascetic or, remove certain digital habits. So I think the counter liturgy is a kind of retraining, right? It's like a retraining of appetites. And it might start off a bit awkward because we're not familiar or not necessarily prone to enjoy certain kinds of new things, but with time, like so many of our habits, we might actually come to really love it, right? And I write in the book, I give this story about how, as someone that was unfamiliar with traditional forms of church liturgy, after 15 years of practicing it, it became something that was just something my body longed for. And I didn't even realize it was happening, until 15 years later. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that spoke to me was not picking up your devices or plugging in, however you want to call it, for the first 15 minutes at least of the day. I believe is the amount of time you had. And you're mentioning, and during COVID, we were on this so much, right? And Zoom so much that I brought out I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and I brought out my Presbyterian book of worship. And so every morning I go through the daily, the daily office, the daily prayer time in the book. Like the book itself was important. Like I wasn't looking at a cell phone. It's also on, devices, but I found that really grounding, and partly probably it could be age, but I just love like the feeling of the paper and the look of the book and the notes I took. And there's something a little bit less alluring about a book, a little bit more subtle. It's not quite in music. It's not fortissimo. It's more mezzo piano. It's like, you're playing a little lighter notes, right? Anyway, so I thought that was a great reminder of why some of those counter liturgies are important. And for me during COVID, the particular times of COVID, like lockdown protocols, et cetera, that was really helpful for me to have that kind of counter liturgy. Could I move to a final question? Is that all right? Unless you wanted to add something what we were just talking about.
That's great.
So with Science for the Church, we're really engaged with this mission of bringing the resources of science in all its forms, social science, psychology, natural sciences, et cetera, to the ministry of Christian churches. And I wonder if there's any final words you'd give, church congregations and or church leaders and or people in the pew with how your work could help them and could assist them and help them grow spiritually.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about digital technology and the church is that at least most American churches that I've observed tend to see technology as a topic, like a
Yeah.
topic to have a Sunday school class on, a topic to have a sermon on, a topic for our youth group to discuss, right? And it's usually a topic that is related to a vice, like pornography or polarization, or right, and that's fine.
Or
There's a
stress, maybe like anxiety or
yeah,
something like that,
yeah,
right?
that's a
Yeah.
good time for that, and there's an appropriate place for that. But I would actually submit that when we do that, we're actually missing. We're completely missing the role that technology is actually playing in our lives. Because I would argue that technology is digital technologies today is successfully discipling us in
Mhm.
ways that are outstripping what our churches are doing and outstripping the discipleship, right, that so many of us actually long to, right, engage in the Christian discipleship. And so it is the practices, it's the picking up of the phone and texting, and right, it's all those small things, right, that is constant and ubiquitous and built into the way we relate with each other, the way we work, the way we do church, even, right? That is, I would argue, forming us in ways that are competing heavily with Christian, what we think of traditionally as Christian discipleship, right? And so,
Yes.
so I know that's a kind of provocative statement to make,
Mhm.
but I think it's something to think about, right? To say, oh, technology isn't a topic, it's actually an issue of discipleship. And if
Right.
as congregations, this is what we're about, right? Is about discipleship, then wow, we better get serious about how are we going to um, pursue discipleship, knowing that there's this other thing that is already discipling us to its
Yes.
story, right?
Yes.
And how do we actively then try to name it, recognize what it is, and then, like the counter liturgies, what's the counter story, right? What is the story that we get from Christ, right? That will actually be good news, so much better news, right? Than technology's story. And I think that will require actually some work for us
Yeah.
right now. I don't actually have all the answers. I'm figuring it out myself. But I think there's just a lot of interesting work that we need to do as people of faith, because it's a different terrain. It's a different kind of consciousness and day-to-day life that we're negotiating.
Yeah. Well, that's like a great place to end, and in reaffirming the good news that we are created in love by Christ and redeemed in that.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
thank you so much. I could talk with you for hours, and I hope there will be a future conversation. But for
That
now,
would be great.
Felicia, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And I do recommend this book, Restless Devices. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Greg.
All right.